All aboard the Skagway streetcar. Hey, and off we go. We are the oldest sightseeing company in Alaska. We were formed in 1923. And our founding father was Martin Itchen, who was the local undertaker, the local Ford dealer, and the local coal delivery man in Skagway, among other things. He'd looked for gold in the Klondike and had never found any. So he came to Skagway. This is where he ended up settling down after the gold rush was over, where he did many different jobs, including running the roulette wheel at the Board of Trade on the weekends. But in 1923, Martin heard that Warren G. Harding, the American president, was coming to our town for 3 hours. And what he did was he took his coal delivery truck, he swept out the back end of it, painted it up like a circus wagon, and wrote Skagway streetcar right across the side of it. He drove it down on the dock here, picked up President Harding and the whole presidential entourage, and gave him the first motorized sightseeing tour that had ever been given in Skagway, Alaska. Mr. Harding loved his tour, and Martin said, I'm on to something here. And for the rest of his days, he drove the Skagway streetcar right here in Skagway and go sightseeing tours of our little town. And today, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you the same exact tour that Martin would have given you if you had ridden with us in Skagway in 1937. Hey! Skagway, Alaska is the farthest north, ice-free, deep water port on the western coast of the North American continent. You can bring a deep draft freighter all the way in here to Skagway, and right here, ladies and gentlemen, you're only 20 miles from the Canadian border. That means, figuratively, that you're only 20 miles from the lead, the zinc, the silver, the tungsten, the copper, the gold. The mineral wealth of the Northwest is just over the line up there, and that means it's easier to bring all of those minerals down to Skagway at the coast than to any other port city for 500 miles on either side of us. Skagway is a Canadian port on American soil, and that's why we're here today. Gold! The word electrifies the world. It jumps to the outside in July of 1897, where it touches off an international stampede immediately. And ladies and gentlemen, on the 29th day of that month, the SS Queen, the mail steamer, comes around the point just like you did this morning and ties up against Captain Moore's brand new dock. That day, 500 people become the instant population of Skagway. Before the end of the month is out, there are 5,000 here. The winter of 97-98, this is a boom town tent city of 20,000 gold-crazed stampeders, and I'm going to drive you right through the middle of Skagway in the days of 98. This is Broadway. There's 8 blocks of bliss laid out right here for your entertainment, folks. Beside us here on the right, this is the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park Visitor Center. The old railroad depot originally, built in 1898. Today inside they have slideshows, movies about the gold rush, interpretive displays. The Park Service is open here till 8 o'clock at night. They have rangers on duty to answer questions as well. And the Park Service owns 13 buildings in Skagway, many of which are being restored and leased back to the private sector for commercial use. The only other park in the United States like this one is the one at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, where the federal government owns buildings which are sandwiched in right into a historic district next to privately owned ones. Ladies and gentlemen, on the left-hand side of the streetcar, a 2-story white frame building with green trim, the notorious Red Onion Saloon and Bordello. Downstairs is the saloon, and upstairs the ladies of the evening, scantily clad, leer out at you. You gentlemen, stay away from the second floor of the Red Onion Saloon. Ladies and gentlemen, on the left of the streetcar, covered with 10,000 individual pieces of driftwood, the Arctic Brotherhood Hall. Ladies and gentlemen, David Preston's Gallery here beside us on the left on the corner. This used to be the old Idaho Saloon. And beside us here on the right, Dr. Keller's Curios. This, of course, was originally an apothecary. Dr. Keller was our druggist. We no longer have a druggist in Skagway. Everything's a curio shop in this town. The Skagway hack, or horse and buggy, is here in front of us here.
We love to tell these stories. The best part of showing Skagway to people is showing them our inside story. We like to tell people who lives in that house and what they do, and if we see somebody's dog running at large down the street, we like to point that out and let them know, oh, there goes the dog. It's something that most people don't experience in the cities where they live. It's small town America, small town from another era. And most people who live in larger communities don't have that kind of closeness to their neighbor. Sometimes that can be a little bit of a problem, but overall, it's a feeling of closeness which is almost like a large family. And we enjoy being able to share that with visitors. The streetcar company being here this many years, as long as it has, from early with Martin and then now over a decade with us, it has quite a history itself. And so by sharing our town in this particular fashion, using the streetcar as the vehicle to show you our town, we have a tendency to being able to pass on to you some of that feeling of not only community, but also the depth of the history of the place.
Looking down into the canyon, you can see today we have the Crystal Symphony. On the other side of the Crystal Symphony, the Executive Explorer, a small vessel, is tied up at the ferry terminal right now. And it's extending down into this waterway known as Taya Inlet. These are the waters, of course, of Lynn Canal. If you were, in fact, to go and take one of these little airplanes from Skagway International Airport, that's right, we have occasional flights from Canada, therefore we're an international airfield. In fact, Carousel 37 is on level 16 down in the brown shack that you see there, our International Airport Terminal. If you flew down the other side of that dark finger land is Haines, Alaska, our nearest sister city. Bustling population of about 2,000 people. Haines actually has 3 grocery stores. We only have 1. On the other side of that far distant range, that's the Chilkat Mountain Range. And the other side of that is Glacier Bay National Park. Glacier Bay is the other side of that range. The biggest mountain around us at 6,800 feet, this is Mount Warren G. Harding, named after the great American president who was here for 3 luxurious hours in 1923. In fact, those of you who may know a living American president, we have an unnamed mountain right here in the middle. We call that Mount Whoever Gets Here Next. The mountain over on the left with 2 horns on it, that's Mount Dewey, named after Admiral Dewey from the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippine Islands. The year is 1898. Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt sends a coded message to Commodore Dewey of the Pacific Squadron. Attack and destroy the Spanish Navy at Manila in the Philippine Islands. Fire when ready, Gridley. We fired first and destroyed the Spanish Navy. Huzzah, huzzah! There were 20,000 good American patriots here when Dewey took Manila. And of course, all of them were drinking in the saloons, all 75 saloons in Skagway, all of them disgruntled because they weren't rich yet in the Klondike Gold Rush. Therefore, when the American victory, the news of that event reached Skagway, everyone partied for 4 days straight, celebrating in the saloons. The last person standing upright named the last thing they could see after Admiral Dewey. What happens here in the wintertime? In the wintertime, the temperature of the bay down here is a balmy 34 degrees Fahrenheit. That's warm water compared with minus 40 below in the Yukon Territory to the north of us, only 100 miles. That's Arctic air. It comes off the polar ice cap. It's come across the interior of the Yukon. It builds up against the inside of the Coast Range. It's got no place to go. And that cold Arctic air spills over the lowest geographic feature in the mountains, White Pass, right above Skagway. And that cold air comes down over the pass, down the canyon, across our little city. That Arctic air hits the warm water here at the coast, and it rises. And it creates a natural vacuum. The wind starts to blow. That's what the natives meant when they called this valley Skagway. Terrible, lousy, nasty, windy place. I mean, only an idiot would build their entire city in a wind tunnel, right? I mean, the natives were smart. They didn't live here at all. They lived over the next ridge in Dyea, the next valley over. There is no wind in the next valley. But you couldn't build a railroad over Chilkoot Pass. It was too steep. So the railroad survey crew chose this valley for the railway line. Tell you what, let's do next. Get your pictures of the ship, the valley, your group at the lookout. Next thing we'll do is we're going to get back on the streetcars and drive north along the Skagway River. and we're going to introduce you to Soapy Smith. Watch your step on the stairway, folks. Watch your step. Skagway.
Skagway, a major port in 1898, where the stampeders, scallywags, and scoundrels landed on their way to the gold fields. As Skagway's population grew, so did the number of entrepreneurs ready to mine the miners. The gold seekers who disembarked from the ships were ready prey for the saloon keepers, entertainers, and the gambling houses. Soapy Smith's gang of cutthroats increased the odds of being robbed, and in the process, cast the image of Skagway as being little better than hell on earth. One of Soapy's more imaginative ventures was his telegraph office. For $5, you could send a telegram anywhere in the world, and if you cared to wait, a reply, collect of course, would likely be forthcoming. Fortunately for Soapy, no one checked the telegraph line, which ended abruptly in the nearby waters of Lynn Canal.
The largest gold nugget in the world. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to show you the Gold Rush Cemetery. Gold Rush Cemetery, Soapy Smith. Good job, Big Red. Stay, sit. Good girl. Gold Rush Cemetery, I'll help you with your doors. My God, man, don't shoot! He cried. Frank Reed, city engineer of Skagway, Alaska. This is the man right here who laid out the streets of our town with his own survey transit, straight and true. Reed was from Oregon, frontiersman, take charge fella. And that night, Frank Reed had a 6-gun on his hip. And he saw Soapy Smith, the outlaw, coming down the dock toward him. He'd had it up to here. Why should we mess around with the outlaws anymore? At 10 paces, eyewitnesses of this event all agree that Frank Reed issued a challenge. But as he did, Soapy yelled back with an oath and dropped his Winchester rifle down off of his shoulder, swinging it like a club, trying to knock Frank off the dock. That's all the provocation Frank Reed needed. Frank reached down, pulled the 6-gun clear of the holster, aimed and pulled the trigger. And that would have been the end of the story. Frank would have fired first. But that's not what happened. The hammer of the pistol fell on a faulty cartridge. No! Reed pulled another time to get another round into the chamber. As he did that, Smith had exactly enough time, seeing death in Reed's eyes, to swing the barrel of his Winchester back to dead center, grab at the trigger, and both men fired simultaneously. Smith took a round in the heart. He was dead before he hit the dock. Frank Reed took a bullet in the groin that shattered his pelvis. He died 12 agonizing days later, and when he was buried, 2,000 citizens gathered right here for the funeral service. There are about 40 of us here now. Imagine what 2,000 people would have looked like. The next spring, a grateful community raised up by subscription a granite memorial, which says quite simply, he gave his life for the honor of Skagway. Soapy Smith lay dead on the end of the dock. His body was forgotten in the excitement while the vigilantes rounded up the rest of the outlaws, captured them, and threw them in jail. 12 were sent to Seattle where they had prices on their heads. It wasn't till late the next day somebody remembered Soapy was still laying on the end of the dock. Nobody remembered to go get him. And then nobody wanted to bury him either. Until the Reverend John Sinclair from the United Church, feeling sorry for the dead dictator, hired a teamster with a horse and a wagon, went down and picked up the body, and they did a brief service. The way of the transgressor is hard. Amen. Let's go. Soapy Smith was actually buried wearing the same black suit that he'd had on when he was shot. Ladies and gentlemen on the streetcar, we're going to get you back aboard the motor cars, drive next through the residential part of town, show you our flower gardens, and then we have a command performance waiting for you back at the Arctic Brotherhood Hall Theater on Broadway. All aboard the streetcars! When I first came up to Skagway, I had an incredible opportunity. I talked to most of the old-timers who lived in town. My favorite gal was Edith Larson. She was 13 years old in August of '97 when she landed on the beach. She said, "Steve, when I came to town, Skagway didn't look like it does today. It looked like a forest full of white tents. My father rented a packing crate, turned it upside down, and became our only piece of furniture, the kitchen table. There was no other wood to be had for love nor money. The sawmills were running night and day, building this city under contract. We moved into our first real home, a log cabin Dad had built Thanksgiving Day, 1897. It was a thankful day. It had been getting mighty cold living in a tent. You can imagine living in a canvas tent with that north wind howling down this valley. Well, because I passed that story on to you, you're now only one step removed from the Klondike Gold Rush. And that's what oral history is all about. Well, we're underway again, folks, heading off down the trail. Once again, on the left, the largest gold nugget in the entire world. Chained securely so no one will steal it, and buried in front of it, Martin Itchen and his wife Lucy. Martin, of course, the man who took President Harding on the tour, and Lucy, the woman who woke Martin up so he would miss the tour. In 1982, the White Pass Railroad shut down. I'd been working as a passenger representative for the company, and I lost my job along with about 185 other people in Skagway. My wife, Gayla, got the idea. Why don't we buy an antique automobile? You could drive that in the summer, like a taxi. And I said, Gayla, the streetcar company. And I went down to see George Rapuzzi. George was 85 at the time. I said, George, we'd like to start up the streetcar again. He said, well, what you going to use for cars? The old one's too fragile. My wife and I had spent our life savings on buying a 1923 Dodge, a 1927 Dodge Brothers Londelay convertible limousine, and a 1932 Ford Paddy wagon, which had been part of the Glendale, California Police Department. I explained that to George, and he said, Dodges? General Blackjack Pershing used Dodges to chase Pancho Villa in Mexico. They're reliable. And Ford, Martin was the Ford dealer. And he gave me his blessing. And the streetcar company's alive and well today, giving people personal tours of our town, just like Martin did back in the 1920s and 30s. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Arctic Brotherhood Hall. The Arctic Brotherhood, whose symbol was a giant gold pan with 3 giant gold nuggets and the letters AB, like you see here above this fireplace. This was a club established in 1899. Their motto, no boundary lines here. This was an international gold rush. People had come here from everywhere in the world. And no matter where in the world you were from, when you got here, you were thousands of miles from home. From your own fireplace and hearth, from friend and family, here on the wind-swept, rain-drenched, snow-covered beaches of Skagway. 12 of these adventurers founded the Arctic Brotherhood, a mutual aid and assistance organization. Only one requirement to be a member. You had to be looking for gold. 20,000 people were in this valley for only one reason. All of them were looking for gold. Everybody could be a member. And this room is where the Arctic Brotherhood held its meetings. But not just Arctic Brotherhood meetings. Because of the size of this building, this room was used for community concerts, for banquets, for dances, for poetry readings for the whole town. This room was the center of Skagway, Alaska in 1899, right here. And as the great Klondike Gold Rush, 100,000 people participating in it swept through these streets on its way toward the north. The Arctic Brotherhood got picked up and carried right along with it, up to Dawson City, Fairbanks, Nome, Alaska. Altogether, 30 Arctic Brotherhood halls like this one were built, each becoming the center of its northern city. But the great gold rushes to the far north stopped No new people came up looking for gold, thus no new members. The order rapidly declined. The last meeting was held in this room, July 11th, 1923, an honorary initiation ceremony for the President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, who was brought in, stood here, and made a member of Camp Skagway No. 1. After that, the Arctic Brotherhood ceased to exist. Until now. I have reorganized the Arctic Brotherhood, and I have proposed each of you for membership in the order. Because I think you're all looking for gold. Golden adventures, golden memories, golden opportunities. Because of this, each of you are worthy candidates to join the Arctic Brotherhood. I've already spoken with the committee. They're in complete agreement. In fact, there's only one remaining task. You must now pass the initiation. Now, when I used to work as a conductor out on the railroad, occasionally I'd pick up my guitar and harmonica and bring it on the train. And somebody'd say, "Hey, he must be the singing brakeman." And I'd go, "Nope, that was Jimmy Rogers back in the 20s. Father of country music, famous recording star." Jimmy Rogers, though, never stayed on the same railroad long enough for a promotion. I did. I'm not the singing brakeman. I'm the singing conductor. They gave him his orders at Monroe, Virginia, saying, "Steve, you're way behind time. This is not 38, this is old 97. Gotta get her in the Spencer on time." Well, he turned around and said to his big greasy fireman, "Throw shovel on a little more coal. 'Cause when we reach that old white oak mountain, gonna watch old 97 roll." Well, it's a mighty rough road from Lynchburg to Danville with a line on a 3-mile grade. It was on that grade that he lost his air brakes. See what a jump he made. Well, he was going down the grade doing 90 miles an hour when his whistle began to scream. He was found in the wreck, his hand on the throttle. He was scalded to death by the steam. Take it, Steve. So began to scream. He was found in the wreck, his hand on the throttle. He was scalded to death by the steam. Yes, he was found in the wreck, his hand on the throttle. He was scalded to death by the steam. In 1935, tourism had dried up in Alaska. Nobody was coming north because of the Depression. Martin decided somebody had to do something. But what? Well, he had just gone down to perhaps forget some of his troubles and gone to a motion picture at the Broadway Theater in Skagway. And that day, the picture was Klondike Annie, starring Mae West. And in her film, she gives one of her most famous lines, "Why don't you come up and see me sometime?" Martin got a brilliant idea. Quickly, he took a photograph of himself standing beside the largest gold nugget in the entire world out at the cemetery. And he sent that to Mae West, care of the studio, with a little note attached that said, "How about I come down to see you?" Signed, "Owner of the largest gold nugget in the world." Mae West wrote back, "Martin, come on down." Martin Itchen loaded the streetcar full of brochures from the Chamber of Commerce, loaded it with a crane onto the deck of the Alaska steamship freighter. Remember, there are no roads to Alaska in 1935. He was unloaded in Seattle on the dock, and he drove the streetcar down the coast highway, handing out brochures to every pump jockey at every gas pump, every waitress at every roadside diner, every town and village, down to sunny California, where Martin Itchen drove the streetcar up to the movie studio gates, honked the horn, rang the bell, and went out to dinner with Mae West. Little Martin Itchen from Skagway, big Mae West, the movie star. The whole Hollywood studio went nuts. I mean, nobody had ever driven out of Alaska to date Mae before. This was a new one.
And they sent their best photography and journalist teams chasing Martin and May all over town to the Chinese Theater, the Ambassador Hotel, pictures of Martin and May posed beside the streetcar. And that night after supper, May put her arm around Martin with the cameras clicking and said, "Martin, you're kind of cute. I think I'll keep you here in Hollywood." And thinking fast with his heavy German accent and his handlebar mustache, Martin quipped right back, "May, you asked me to live in Hollywood for the rest of my sweet life, but I could not leave old Skagway, my home, my heart, my wife." He did 3 more weeks at the Orpheum Theater in San Francisco, became the toast of the West Coast, and the next year, tourism doubled in Skagway, thanks entirely to the efforts and promotions of Martin Itchen and the Skagway streetcar.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, your applause has just awakened the President of the United States, Warren G. Harding. He's been sleeping in the ether up on the ceiling up there. Good afternoon, Mr. President. We have worthy candidates here who await to join the Arctic Brotherhood. But first, you got to mix your voices with the other Arctic brothers and sisters over the years singing on the Arctic Brotherhood initiation song. You all know the words. You've been singing this song since you were about knee-high to a sluice box. So sing along and join the Arctic Brotherhood. Song goes like this. Oh, give me a home between Fairbanks and Nome, where the moose and the caribou play, where nothing will grow because it's covered with snow from June until the following May. Home at home in the snow, where it's mild when it's only 40 below. It's the tundra for me by the old Bering Sea, and the life of an old sourdough. Give yourself a round of applause. Woo! Welcome, welcome, brothers and sisters, to Grand Camp number 1 of the AB. And as you travel around the world now, tell everybody you meet, you're members of the Arctic Brotherhood. You joined in Skagway. And if they're good friends, tell them our secret. Our secret? Gold is where you find it. And I hope every one of you find at least a little bit of gold on your own personal Alaskan adventure, whatever that may be. Because I'll tell you, during my own very brief 22-year adventure in this country, I've discovered there's so many golden stories here. We have not yet started digging them all up yet. In fact, the story I have for you right now is a visual one. We call this the Skagway story.
They posed with their sled dogs on the way to the gold fields. They killed their pack horses by the thousands, driving them to death in their mad rush to get over the passes. They blazed trails and built cities that stand to this day. These were the Klondikers. This is their story, and the story of one of their most enduring monuments, Skagway, Alaska. The Indians called it Skagway, home of the north wind. Pioneer steamboat man Captain William Moore called it an opportunity. In 1887, while working for a Canadian survey expedition, Moore crossed the White Pass, a narrow notch that led over the mountains. Moore believed there was gold in the Yukon, and he was immediately convinced that the new route would give ideal access to the interior when the big strike was finally made. He envisioned a horse trail, wagon road, a railroad built through to the lakes. Moore staked out a claim, built a cabin and a dock, and waited for the big stampede. On August 17, 1896, George Washington Carmack's Skookum Jim and Tagish Charlie discovered gold on a tributary of the Klondike River in the Yukon. Word spread like wildfire through the north, and when it reached the outside world in July of '97, the rush was on. Thousands of men jammed the decks of steamships up the Alaskan Inside Passage, landing at the twin coastal boom towns of Skagway and Dyea. At Dyea, an Indian trail led over the mountains through Chilkoot Pass. The final pitch to the summit was too steep for horses and required chopping steps out of the icy slope, 1,000 of them, nicknamed the Golden Stairs. Everything came up on your back. At the summit, the Northwest Mounted Police checked that every stampeder had a full ton of supplies, 2,000 pounds, enough to live unaided in the north for a year. If you didn't have your outfit, you couldn't enter Canada. From Skagway, Captain Moore's trail was advertised as fit for horses. Anyone who could afford the whopping $150 per horse could buy animals right on the beach. But the men were not horsemen. They overloaded and overworked their animals, literally driving them to death. 3,000 pack horses were killed the winter of 1897-98. Jack London remarked that their hearts turned to stone, these men on the dead horse trail. Back down in Skagway, men crowded into the city saloons and bars, and money flowed fast and loose. The setup was perfect for some enterprising outlaw to corner the action for himself. And that's exactly what Captain Jefferson Randolph Soapy Smith did. One of the West's most seasoned confidence men, Smith ran his empire from his saloon. His men, out on the street, operated everything from crooked shell games and roulette wheels to elaborate muggings and robberies. But Soapy rode his reign only briefly in Skagway. His men stole a poke of gold dust from a returning miner, and the town rose up against him with vigilante justice. A gun battle on the old Juneau Company wharf settled the matter for all time, making a hero out of city surveyor Frank Reed and a legend out of Soapy Smith. Skagway got rid of Soapy, but the bigger problem of how to get the stampeders over the narrow, rocky trails remained until construction began in May of '98 on the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad. Contractor Mike Heaney's track climbed the dreaded pass and down to the Yukon headwaters. But winter in the pass was a constant battleground where blizzards buried the line in minutes. Powerful rotary snowplows were brought in to get the trains through. But the stampeders couldn't wait around for a railroad to be built. As fast as they could, they made it over the trails to Lake Bennett, where they built boats to await the spring thaw. When the ice broke in May 1898, an armada of 7,000 homemade watercraft of every description cast off. This was the last leg of their journey, 450 miles down the Yukon River, to finally reach Dawson City at the heart of the Klondike goldfields. They discovered that most of the claims had been already staked out a full year earlier. After wandering through the bustle of this unlikely muskeg metropolis, many sold their remaining outfits and bought steamboat tickets home. Others stampeded off again when gold was discovered only a few months later at Nome, Alaska. Their departure brought down the curtain on a great epic adventure. But Captain Moore's vision of Skagway was correct. The strategic wharves and the White Pass Railroad provided an economic base for the town as the gold rush ebbed. Dyea was not so fortunate. The completion of the modern steam railroad spelled the end of the Chilkoot Trail as a competitive route into the interior. This tale of two cities was a battle to the death, and today's Dyea is a ghost town of second-growth forest. Only a few crumbling vestiges remain from a city of 10,000 people at the foot of the Chilkoot Trail. Yukon mining kept the docks and railroad busy through the First World War. Copper ore added to the gold and silver already rolling in on the trains. But the business district moved from the cross streets laid out for the stampeders to Broadway along the railroad track. It was here that Skagway's merchants could cater to the train and steamship passengers and to the new summertime tourist trade. After 1918, the mines went into decline. Many businesses closed their doors. A high note came in July 1923 when American President Warren G. Harding stopped in town on his Alaskan visit. President Harding was given the Grand Skagway Tour by Martin Itchen in his Skagway streetcar and was made a member of the Arctic Brotherhood at a special initiation ceremony held in the A.B. Hall. Grand Camp Number 1. Over the years, a center for special events, A.B. ceremonies, banquets, concerts, even theatrical productions. It's one of the most unique buildings in Alaska and one of the most photographed. By the 1930s, the town's glamour had faded. The few tourists complained of the boarded-up windows and empty rows of storefronts, hotels, and saloons. The railroad was down to 1 train a month in the winter, and there was talk of closing the line. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Overnight, a supply route was needed to defend Alaska, and the Alaska Highway Project swung into gear. Skagway became a military port. Construction materials were shipped north over the railroad. As many as 34 trains a day were run at the height of the war. But when the Army left, Skagway's second boom went with it. After the war, Yukon mining and construction projects fueled the growth of a new Skagway. The railroad was modernized. Containerized freight ships called in at the port, and local merchants played on the theme of the Klondike Gold Rush for the growing number of tourists. In 1963, the Alaska Marine Highway began service, providing regular deliveries of fresh groceries and hardware. Air service, which had begun in the 1920s, came into its own with a new Skagway Airport. A huge Yukon lead-zinc-silver mine, Cypress Anvil, opened in 1969, requiring a new ore terminal and dock. Ore ships and cruise ships could share this additional dock facility. And local boosters finally saw another long-time dream come true in 1978. The new Klondike Highway was finally blasted through the mountains, connecting Skagway with Whitehorse, the Alaska Highway, and the rest of the North American highway system. When world metal prices collapsed in 1982, the Anvil mine closed, forcing the WP and YR to suspend all rail service. Both the mine and the railroad have reopened, but now the ore is trucked to Skagway by highway, and the trains operate exclusively for summer excursion passengers. Skagway's residents have seen a lot of change in 90 years, but even today, the town can boast a dozen families which can trace their roots back to the Klondike Gold Rush. William John Mulvihill arrived in Alaska during construction of the White Pass Railroad in 1900. He had worked for a number of mainline railroads and hired on as a telegrapher, rising to the position of chief dispatcher. His son Mickey worked as a conductor, and Mickey's son Carl also worked on the railroad. Carl lives in Skagway today, is a noted railroad historian, and the town's fire chief. Frank Dedman was a partner in the original Golden North Hotel. In 1908, he moved the old Klondike Trading Company building to Broadway, added a 3rd floor, and opened the new Golden North Hotel. His wife and son, Henry, set up a photography shop. The family lost the hotel in the Depression, but continued their photography business. Dedman's granddaughter, Barbara Callan, who was born in Skagway, still runs Dedman's Photo Shop. She's a nationally published photographer, and she has grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a 6th generation of Klondikers. Drop into Dedman's and say hello to Barbara if you're passing by. Another Gold Rush family was headed by former Mayor Bill Firo. He too was 3rd-generation Skagway, and the Firos have children and grandchildren in Alaska today. Bill's grandfather, John E. Firo, was one of the most colorful packers on the White Pass Trail during the Gold Rush. He lost his life in a blizzard at the top of the pass the winter of 1897-98. The family stayed on. Bill's wife, Bev, also comes from Skagway. Her father was White Pass Railroad conductor Bill Beitinger. Harriet Pullen was Skagway's most famous hotelier. She made her Pullen House into an oasis of comfort and service. President Harding gave his speech to the town from her front porch during his visit. She's buried above the site where her grand hotel once stood. The property no longer belongs to the family. Harriet's granddaughter, Maxine Selmer, makes her home in town today, and Harriet's great-granddaughter, Stephanie, was married in the Skagway Presbyterian Church. George Rapuzzi was Skagway's most respected historian. Born in Skagway in 1899, he lived in the community all his life and collected its history. He was close friends with Martin Itchen and helped Martin as mechanic on the original Skagway streetcars. When Martin and his wife Lucy passed away, George took on Martin's collection, and his wife Edna expanded and ran Martin's Soapy Smith Museum. George's memory was razor sharp. He provided a personal history of the town's changes to anyone who wanted to listen, and he never missed driving the original streetcar down Broadway in the 4th of July parade. George Rapuzzi passed away in November 1986 at the young age of 87. Edna joined him a year later. Today, Edna's niece Phyllis Olson Brown still trots out the streetcar each 4th of July as a lively tribute to the memory of George and Edna Rapuzzi. And thanks to George, the streetcar company continues today, just as Martin would have wanted it to. Its conductors showing all points of interest to visitors from all over the world.
I'm an authorized Ford dealer and undertaker with all kind of supplies and hope to be a doctor before many years go by. But I'm quite well satisfied with the progress I have made, for I have designed and built a streetcar for the Skagway tourist trade. Conditions now are different. I earn an honest living now. I drive the Skagway streetcar for my daily chow.
Well, folks, that's Skagway. And now, your part of the story. Because a town is much more than docks and buildings. It's the people who've been there and their stories. These, then, are the real Klondike legacy. A legacy to be passed on to each new generation of Klondikers, children and grandchildren, who each, in their turn, will write new chapters to the story of Skagway, gateway to the Yukon.